Let's go ahead and pray together, and then we'll start talking a little bit of Jeremiah. We're almost through the second chapter, I believe, so let's pray. Father, you've seen everything that we have to be embarrassed about, and so I ask that you forgive us when we forget who we really are, and when we have a inaccurate or inappropriate view of ourselves. Since you've described your word as a mirror, I pray that we're looking carefully to see exactly what we see, to be exposed to who we really are and how we actually look to you. And so God, as a result of this experience, help us to identify some things that we can adjust in our lives to be better people, to be more holy people. And thank you for the privilege of sharing this study with such a wonderful group of people. And I pray this in Jesus' name. Okay, I'm going to pick... Okay. There's technology for
Guardians
you.
of the Galaxy too. There you go.
Guardians of the Galaxy. I'm going to pick up in Jeremiah chapter 2. You may want to turn there in your actual Bible if the screen doesn't want to cooperate. That's strange. Was my prayer not good enough?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. Chapter 2, picking up around verse 25. Hopefully it'll stay up. And if you recall last week, the prophet was talking about the sinful condition of God's people, the people of Judah at this time. They should have known better because they're only half of what's left of God's people of Abraham in the beginning. First half got taken out by Assyria some odd years before this. And they're left, they should have realized a thing or two, and God's going to be talking about that. But instead, they're kind of adopting a, oh, I'm better than you attitude. Like, well, clearly, God loves me more than you because Northern Kingdom's gone, but we must be privileged or special somehow. Almost like they are entitled to some of this favor of God. Well, when you live that way, you tend to not hold God in the kind of reverence you should. You could revere him a lot more, but instead of that, they've gone the opposite direction. So God described last week how he sees them, and very, very gruesome, graphic language, particular language about describing the donkey, for one thing, how, oh, you're like a wild donkey that just wants to mate, and as filthy of a thing as that is, and you guys know what it looks like, that's what I'm seeing when I look at your situation. You are like this creature, and you just can't stop yourself. You just want to keep on going. So we're kind of in the middle of a situation where it's pretty ugly, and unfortunately, there's a lot of that ugliness, a lot of that ugliness in the book. And that's one of those things, too, that if you are dealing with sin, and sin is an ugly thing, then you're going to get dirty in the process of dealing with it. And God doesn't shy away in Scripture talking about what sin looks like. And there are a number of those passages that, it's okay. You don't have to, let me be careful how I say this, but I don't believe every single passage is appropriate to read to little kids. At least not yet. There needs to be a certain maturity level because there are some very graphic things that God will call out specifically. And he's speaking to an audience that understands and knows better, and so we need to kind of appropriately judge that. But he's not going to pull any punches. He'll say what it is. So in verse 25, this prophecy continues, and so Jeremiah continues here. God through him says, keep your feet from being unshod, and your throat from thirst. But you said, it is hopeless. No. For I have loved strangers, and after them I will walk. As a thief is shamed when he is discovered, so the house of Israel is shamed. They, their kings, their princes, and their priests, their prophets, who say to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave me birth. For they have turned their back to me and not their face. But in the time of their trouble, they will say, arise and save us. But where are your gods, which you made for yourself? Let them arise, if they can save you. In the time of your trouble, for according to the number of your cities are your gods, O Judah. What does he mean, according to the number of your cities are your gods? Just kind of a funny way to say that. What does he mean?
Got a lot of
You got a whole lot of idols. That's how many you have. You are just, and by the way, one of the very significant things is the sheer number when we're talking about the people of God. Monotheistic religion, the idea of one God, it's kind of a groundbreaking thought. You know, when we hear about that, when Moses is writing back and we read about it in Genesis and everything, very revolutionary in a lot of ways, not a commonplace thing. And they're falling back into the old ways, which proved to be not accurate, not right. So in verse 26, when he's talking about as the thief is shamed when he's discovered, so the house of Israel is shamed, their kings, their princes, their priests, their prophets. Before that, in the first verse, he says, keep your feet from being unshod. Put some shoes on. It's my understanding that in the worship of Baal, which is one of the big, fertility gods that they were involved in worshiping all the time, there were a lot of practices and strange things. Many of them are bad. And some of them involved a heavy amount of barefoot dancing. So the fact that they're dancing barefoot or whatever, it could just be, there's lots of that. There's lots of chanting that would go on as well. And I don't know if it would necessarily cause sores in your feet or not. That doesn't necessarily matter. But when he says keep your feet from being unshod, it could just be another reference to stop doing these kind of things. Stop doing these kind of practices that are associated with other gods. Quit that. A reference for that is 1 Kings 18, verse 26. 1 Kings 18, verse 26. We know from the Old Testament that the prophets of Baal, when we read about them on Mount Carmel, because the prophet Elijah has challenged them and said, hey, if Baal is God, let's see if he can create fire from heaven and light up this sacrifice. Well, when he challenges them, what do the prophets of Baal do? There are, 450 prophets of Baal and 400 prophets of Asherah, I believe, total 850. And when you read about that contest at Mount Carmel, what was it that these prophets of Baal started doing? Yeah, crying out, Baal, Baal, Baal. He's not listening. Cutting themselves. Why? Have mercy. I'm hurting myself, Which, by the way, that's a definition of an abusive, not abusive. What kind of relationship? A dysfunctional relationship. Like, oh, I'm hurting. Help me, help me. They thought they could manipulate their God, some incredible God that they're manipulating, Crying out to him, they would cut themselves, they would scream, and they would keep on going and act like animals just to get the attention of their God. So, God's describing them before this, saying, you look like animals, you act like an animal, whoring after all these other gods. And would you quit these practices that are very savage, that go right along with this Baal worship? And by the way, this is a complete side note, but, and this is going to show my ignorance, sorry about this. When lightning strikes the ground or any object, does it tend to leave a giant crater? Very big. Has that happened where it leaves a massive crater or a big hole? I don't remember that anyway. I remember I've seen a few lightning strikes in front of me and they really got my attention, but I remember just saying, oh look, the tree's died now because I'm just thinking, the fire from heaven that Elijah prayed and that God sent was so monumental that it could lick up all the liquid in the ground and everything. And it just makes me wonder, how big of a lightning bolt would it take to do something like that? Could that be the biggest lightning bolt in human history? I just wonder about that on a side note. But there's no contest here. We know who won in a very, very big way. But these kind of things happen. So God's calling them out. Hey, you call for me when you need help. Why don't you call to your gods? You have as many of them as you have cities.
Yeah, before you leave that
talking about your feet unshod. One of the euphemisms in the Old Testament, when they didn't want to refer to your private parts, they would talk about your feet. And so if somebody's going to the bathroom in the Old Testament, they say you covered your feet. So your clothes would be covering your feet. But when the seraphim had 6 wings, with 2 they covered their face, with 2 they flew, and with 2 they covered their feet. It's probably a polite way of saying they,
Really modest.
yeah, they covered their private parts.
Ah.
And so since this is so sexual, it was a often used euphemism in the Old Testament. Maybe he's talking about you're running around naked.
That would very well fit with the context too, yeah.
I was also thinking about the reference to God's provision in the desert. He said they walked for 40 years without their sandals wearing out or their clothes wearing out, and then right after that it's saying,
And now that
They're
they're
thrown.
there, kick your shoes off and don't even need God.
yeah, right, now we don't need you.
Wow, good thoughts. Good thoughts. Man, that makes sense, yeah.
What does the word unshod mean?
Somebody else explained that better than me. I think it means this,
Take a, yes, exactly. what it means.
but I won't, I'll put it back. Yeah, I think it just means not wearing
NIV
clothes.
says bear your feet.
Bear your feet.
On the horse, right?
Yeah, bury your feet. Yeah, yeah. Sometimes, this is New American Standard Version, by the way, is what I'm looking at. So sometimes the wording in English is a little different. But yeah, boy, good points. Yeah, when we talk about euphemisms, I'm glad you brought that up because there are many in the book of Jeremiah, but there are many throughout the Bible too. The euphemism for sex is the word no. A lot of times, Adam knew his wife and she conceived and gave birth, so it's a euphemism for sexual activity. That's important to know because Sodom and Gomorrah, when the men came out because they saw the heavenly messengers, they thought they were men as well. They said, bring these men out to Lot, bring these men out so that we may know them. I've actually read an article where they were trying to say, no, they weren't doing anything bad. They just wanted to have a little meet and greet. No, they didn't want to have a little meet and greet. That's a euphemism, And it also says, is it Leviticus 18, I believe, is the passage where it talks a lot about sexual laws, and it will talk about uncovering the nakedness as well. Another euphemism for sex. It's not just looking at something, it's talking about sexual activity as well. So, yeah, definitely makes sense. And would also very much fit with the fertility cult, the uncovering of the feet. Thanks for pointing that out. So they've got all these gods. Why don't you use them? But it's as though they'll turn to God when they need something done. Boy, if I didn't know any better, it would make me wonder if that wasn't exactly like most Christians I know today. I have so many issues in life. It's a good thing I've got a lot of money, a lot of pull in society, a lot of stuff that I can take care of each one of these issues until finally I found one that's just a little too big for me. God, oh God, I need you here. You got a problem. And then God's got to be wondering, well, you've got all these other idols that take care of your problems. Why do you need me now?
Yeah.
Just makes me wonder, is that the kind of thing that is tempting to do? I think it's very, very tempting to do. So maybe the challenge, and I don't know how you guys feel about this, but a lot of times I focus so much on the big things and I forget about the little things. When in reality, if I were fixated on the little things, you wouldn't miss the big things, right? Well, I shouldn't say that. You can't sometimes miss the big things, but you tend to do better. So sometimes maybe it's, like for instance, tithing is a good one. If you're going to give God, offerings, it's so much easier when you're broke. Just being honest with you. If you've got no money, you've got $2 to your name, it's so much easier to tithe because you only got $2, A lot of times people do the exact opposite. They say, I'm too poor. There's no way I could do that. No, it's actually a lot easier now. It's going to be a lot more complicated when you got lots of money because it gets complicated. That's just one example. Many other areas in life, right? So many of these things can get in the way. God's not our servant, we're his. You know what I mean? So we have to make sure, are we worshiping God through the little things, through every little thing that we do? Are we letting him have control of those? Because he will take care, he will provide for the bigger things and the smaller things, but he wants us to rely on him, not the other way around. And you guys understand there's the fine line of worshiping God and ignoring what he tells you to do at a practical level. If you're starving but you're not working, you're not really worshiping God because you're not working, you're not trying, you know what I mean? We understand there's a practical level, and that's all part of obeying God. So I think you guys understand that. Let's move on. Verse 29 and following. Why do you contend with me? You all have transgressed against me, declares the Lord. In vain I have struck your sons. They accepted no chastening. Your sword has devoured your prophets like a destroying lion. O generation, heed the word of the Lord. Have I been a wilderness to Israel? Or a land of thick darkness? Why do my people say, we are free to roam? We will no longer come to you. Can a virgin forget her ornaments or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me, days without number. How well you prepare your way to seek love. Therefore, even the wicked woman, you have taught your ways. So God uses the metaphor of a child, and he's administering discipline. What's the purpose of discipline? Is it for you to get rid of that pent-up anger you got against this unruly kid, so you just, let's let him have it? Or is there a different purpose? What is the purpose of proper discipline?
Reconciliation.
The teaching method, to bring about the right kind of change, to mold some character here. And man, that's a good indication. The discipline's not for you, and the discipline is not about how you feel. The discipline is for the benefit of the one being chastened, right? Or being disciplined. Well, God is disciplining his people, but it's not working. He's allowing these things to happen, but he says it's in vain. Which, you know what? That is very interesting. What's the one command about discipline in the New Testament that's directed only at fathers?
Grow your kids up in the Lord.
Yeah, you're supposed to grow your kids up in the Lord, but he shifts gears and he says, fathers, don't what?
Exasperate.
Don't exasperate your kids. Yeah. Do not exasperate your kids. It's funny, why single out fathers for that? Maybe he knows it's a tendency that we may have a little bit more. I don't know how you guys feel when you're disrespected. I think I do know how you feel. Probably similar to the way I feel. It doesn't feel very good, and it's very easy to want to retaliate. And we're going to have a battle of wills here, and we know whose will is going to win in this battle, right? Well, it can be very easy to push it a little bit too hard, and it seems to me we've got to discern whether or not the discipline is working. Because the mode of discipline we use, it's not really about the mode or the amount, it's about the result, right? The character being developed. And man, I have to learn, not every method works for every person. My old professor said, just in case this matters to you guys if you're in a situation like this, he said that they had a daughter that could not quit crying. Wouldn't quit crying, whining about probably eating her food at the table, just wanted to eat, just wouldn't stop. Wouldn't stop sitting there not eating her food and just throwing a temper tantrum. So they didn't know what to do. They tried spankings and all these other things, nothing worked. And then finally, an older woman said, hey, I have something that you should do, and shared it. I said, okay, we'll try it. So they waited for the next temper tantrum, and sure enough, it happened. And so what did they do? They went to the kitchen, they grabbed a full glass of water, walked over to that crying kid, and doused the kid in water. And he said it never happened again. I found that quite intriguing, and I've been waiting for a moment. And if any of you get that chance, I want to hear how that goes. Just because it worked for him, I'm not convinced that that's going to be the cure-all method of that, yeah. And then I don't want that to elevate to a drowning problem. Maybe it doesn't work the first time. There are some very creative means, and man, I love it when people are skilled enough to figure out a punishment that fits the crime, in a sense, that helps you think about the refining aspect of what's going on. Because obviously the purpose of punishment isn't just for you to suffer, although suffering you should associate suffering with the consequences of evil. But man, if you could suffer for a purpose of something more valuable, my father-in-law talked about a discipline that he received older in life, probably in his 20s, probably. He and his buddies were driving something, probably going too fast, down a highway, and the side of this highway was some sort of construction site. They had cones everywhere. So they had an old enough car, they didn't care, so what do? They pulled off the road, and they were running into cones. Boom, 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 having so much fun. I don't know how many miles they went, making cones fly off the road. And then a cop catches them. And the cop gives them the speech, hey, I can write you guys up for a very, very hefty fine and a lot of trouble. Or you can get back out there and you can pick up every single cone. And they did. And you know what he'll say? He never did a thing like that again. I think it's smart, just very practical, and it makes good sense. So the right kind of discipline, but I got to tell you, if anyone should know how to properly administer discipline, I think it would be God.
Oh, yeah.
And he's administering the discipline, and it's not working. Just a reminder, I don't want to take this too far necessarily, but this is more proof to me of the evidence of free will in Scripture. Same thing with our kids too, or the people we know. Maybe there's nothing wrong with the techniques that we're using as far as discipline goes. Maybe we're doing everything right. It doesn't force the right result, right? People choose to do what they want to do. And if God himself had failures with his own kids, it's a pretty good indication that that may be something that will happen too. It's a risk that we take, right? You all could have chosen a robot for kids. You could have gotten, the latest technology of whatever, cost you a lot less money, and that thing would always be obedient. But instead, many of you chose for kids. And those things can let you down, really disappoint you. But it was your choice, and I think I know why you did. It's the right thing. So anyway, discipline. Verse 31 is a reminder, God's asking by throwing out this way, have I been a wilderness to Israel, or a land of thick darkness? We're in the wilderness, you got nothing. When you're in the dark, you can't see, you stumble, you get hurt. God is asking these questions with an obvious answer. The obvious answer is what? No, I haven't been. He's restating from a negative perspective. He's saying, I've been there for you all along. Don't you remember? Think about this. I was always there for you. I've always taken care of you. And then he continues that thought. And a virgin, when it says forget her ornaments, or a bride, her attire, probably talking about when a woman was pledged to be married, there was an expensive dowry that had to be paid before that wedding would take place. And it's interesting to me because there are ways of looking at this, and I think the American way is to immediately think, oh, you're treating women like property, that sounds awful, that sounds heartless, that sounds terrible. But I think that's an inappropriate way of looking at it, because even though the view of that day was probably not the best view, definitely lowering women as far as the society, and definitely looking at them as more like property, God comes along and says, no, you need to put a very high dollar value on this woman. Everyone else might say you just take her, or get her for what you can get and that's it. God, on the other hand, made them fork over an amount of money that I believe is close to 2 years worth of your salary. A pretty hefty amount of money, and that money was for her to be taken care of in case you didn't do your job right, or in case you didn't come through, or you were not faithful to her. That money would go to support her so that she could live, she could move back to her father's house and be taken care of. So that is actually, I think, a really good thing. Now, if you are a woman in this society and someone forked over 2 years of their savings, or in the case of a person named Jacob, 7 years of their savings to get you, you think you'd forget all about that? Like, oh yeah, those ornaments, those expensive things that, not a big deal. It's only 7 years. I can work that off. I don't think you would. I don't think you would. That's a very high dollar item. And so God's saying, have you forgotten, the things I have done for you? The price I have continually paid for you to take care of you? So these jewels are things that would be a part of the woman's dowry. She's not going to forget that. And so God's calling them out saying, well, why have you forgotten me? how well you prepare your way to seek love. He's calling them a wicked woman, but that's an understatement. That is a big understatement. What kind of a woman, what kind of a prostitute, if you will, are these people in God's eyes? Look at the very last verse we read there, end of verse 33. They're the teachers. They're the instructors of wicked women. If you want to learn how to be a more wicked, if you want to learn how to be a more wicked woman, then you're the teacher of that class. They'll go to you. That's really, really bad. They have chosen a terrible, terrible direction, and it's just such a sad choice to be made. Also, on your skirts is found the lifeblood of the innocent poor. You did not find them breaking in, but in spite of all these things, yet you said, I'm innocent. Surely his anger is turned away from me. Behold, I will enter into judgment with you, because you say I have not sinned. Why do you go around so much changing your way? Also, you will be put to shame by Egypt, as you are put to shame by Assyria. From this place also you will go out with your hands on your head, for the Lord has rejected those in whom you trust, and you will not prosper. You will not prosper with them. So, there again, we're kind of back to the court scene here. God is further presenting his very clear case. Look at the evidence of what you guys have done. And their response, no, I didn't. No, I didn't. Now, I don't know if you've been in an argument where someone just says no, and that's all they say. No, no, no. But it's very hard to get anywhere when someone will not present evidence. They will only make assertions. And so God is pulling out the evidence, and they're, in spite of the evidence, saying, we didn't do anything wrong. We're fine. Well, why don't you bring forth some sort of evidence or some sort of case? And they're just not willing to do that. In verse 36 and 37, the idea seems to be that not only are they weak in the realm of arguments to defend themselves against God, which they can't anyway, but not only that, when it comes to their worshiping of other gods, they're relying on others, they're not even consistent in that. They're wishy-washy. They'll go back and forth. Well, that's probably what he's talking about. You go around so much, in verse 36, why do you go around so much changing your way? You will be put to shame by Egypt. It's as though they couldn't even figure out, like, do we want to rely on God? No, probably not. We'll go to Egypt. Egypt will take care of us. Oh, but wait, there's the remnant of Assyria. They're still around. They're powerful. I know they're scary, but yeah, we can go to them. No, I think Egypt, they might take care of it. They can't even make up their mind. They're flip-flopping. You know, they're being like the modern day politician, just trying to, well, which way is the wind blowing? What do the people want to hear? Let's put that out there and let's do that, And God has not changed, and so he's seeing, man. So what is he specifically talking about here? Were there any examples that we know of where the people chose to rely on another nation instead of God?
All the time.
All the time, you're right. In the days of a man named Ahaz, this would be right around Hezekiah's time. Remember Ahaz? He's got to go down in Scripture as one of the dumbest, if not the dumbest man to walk this planet. Why was this guy so dumb? You remember his situation?
Blank check.
Yes, God said, "You're king of my people. You're, scared of what could happen to you. Don't you worry. I'm going to take care of you. Ask me what you want. Ask me anything. Whatever it is, I will provide for you." Who else was given that blank check from God? What's that?
Solomon.
Yeah, King Solomon, and he chose wisely. He at least chose something, right? Even if he chose poorly, he would have got something. Ahaz, for the strangest reason, it just boggles my mind. As much male pride as I have, I still don't get it. He said, "No thanks, I got this." And instead of accepting God's offer, he went to God's temple and sold the gold there, any items of value, so he could pay a foreign army to fight the battle for him. I mean, you talk about a deliberate... when I first read that and heard about that, I was younger, and there was a part of me that thought, well, I was trying to be sympathetic. Maybe he was trying to be polite. Maybe he was trying to, God, you've got things going on. Don't you worry. I don't want to bother you with my meager little problems. And do that? Well, that is completely the wrong way to look at it. If we're dealing with another human, I get it, because humans get tired and grow weary. God does not get tired. God has literally all the time in the world and then some. So for you to reject him, you're doing nothing but insulting him. You're doing nothing but saying, stay out of it. Get out of here. I'm taking care of this myself. And for him to take a vested interest in you and for you to cut that off and then insult him further by going to his temple and selling the stuff they had there, just dumb. Just plain dumb all the way around. So perhaps Jeremiah's mentioning this and the people he's alluding to this kind of thing. Because that would be one that they should be pretty familiar with. It wasn't all that long ago. It was still a bit that it happened. But when they did that and they hired the Assyrians, did that alliance last? No, of course not. All that money they spent on something didn't last. It held them off for a little while, but then they're going to want more. Things are going to change and they're going to want it. So it was just a miserable failure. So we get into chapter 3. And God uses this analogy. He continues with the bridal analogy, and it's interesting to me. God says, if a husband divorces his wife and she goes from him and belongs to another man, will he still return to her? Will not that land be completely polluted? If you guys have a moment, if you could turn to Deuteronomy chapter 24, that would be helpful. Deuteronomy chapter 24, the first 4 verses. I'm going to ask someone to read that in just a minute, okay? Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. But let's continue here. Will not the land be completely polluted? But you are a harlot with many lovers. Yet you turn to me, declares the Lord. Lift up your eyes to the bare heights and see. Where have you not been violated? By the roads you have sat for them like an Arab in the desert. You have polluted a land with your harlotry and with your wickedness. Therefore the showers have been withheld, and there has been no spring rain. Yet you have a harlot's forehead. You refuse to be ashamed. Have you not just now called to me? My father, you are the friend of my youth. Will he be angry forever? Will he be indignant to the end? Behold, you have spoken and have done evil things, and you have had your way. Okay, first of all, he talks about, after a divorce, if a husband divorces his wife and goes to another man, should there be a remarriage? Is that something that is okay? Who's got Deuteronomy 24, the first 4 verses? Please read that.
When a man takes a wife and marries her, if then she finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house, and if she goes and becomes another man's wife, and the latter man hates her, and writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter man dies who took her to be his wife, then her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she has been defiled, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance.
Thank you. So the Old Testament law answers the question, is that allowed to happen?
No.
Absolutely not. God's made it clear. You are not supposed to do that in my law to the Israelites. That's not what you're supposed to do. So they are aware that they've been commanded that initially. And so God's bringing it up again, something that they should be familiar with, and said, you guys as a whole, as a society, have chosen to be like one woman who has nothing to do with me, and you've run off and you've slept with others and you've committed yourself to them. Is it right? Is that just okay for you to just come back to me? Well, it wasn't something that was okay in the law of Moses. It wasn't something that was okay there. He talks about their forehead. When I think of the forehead, which when I think of the forehead now, I think about something that Brandon and I were talking about, because Roger Chambers used to explain to us that in heaven everyone has flat foreheads. Did you guys know that? In heaven, everyone has a flat forehead. You know why? Because all the time you're going around asking questions and God will answer it and you'll say, I didn't know that. Oh, I get it. So everyone's got a flat forehead. Just heads up. But the idea of something on your forehead is it's pretty obvious. Have you ever tried to not look at something on somebody's face that's just, hey there, you know? It's the hardest thing, right? You know, to ignore it, because I think that's what we're talking about here. You know, you've got a harlot's forehead. You're making it very, very obvious to everyone. You're not ashamed of this. You're very clear in who you are, and everyone knows it. But in verse 4 and verse 5, Judah pretends, no, we love you, God. We're committed to you. Really? You didn't love me before I started making it not rain. You didn't love me that much. You didn't seem that committed before I brought a big drought. Now all of a sudden you love me? Just doesn't sound very loving, does it? So God's calling them out on that. They are willing to shift back their attitude to God if it means something good for them. Which there again, Christians, are we glad to shift back our attitude to God when life's gotten hard and we need some things cleaned up, fixed? But then when life is good, got other things to do. We don't do that. We don't do that. Hopefully not. Right? So in verse 6 and following, then the Lord said to me, in the days of Josiah the king, have you seen what faithless Israel did? She went up on every high hill and under every green tree, and she was a harlot there. I thought after she had done all these things, she would return to me. But she did not return, and her treacherous sister Judah saw it. And I saw that for all the adulteries of faithless Israel, I had sent her away and given her a writ of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear. But she went and was a harlot also. Because of the lightness of her harlotry, she polluted the land and committed adultery with stones and trees. Yet in spite of all this, her treacherous sister Judah did not return to me with all her heart, but rather in deception, declares the Lord. If you could flip to Leviticus 18:18, that would be helpful. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 18. So what's the picture? God talks about the sisters. Picture of the sisters. Who's the first sister? Up north? Israel. Israel would be the northern kingdom, and then the other sister is Judah, that's the south. Initially, the land of Israel was all one kingdom, but then after Solomon, because of Solomon's sinful activity in the time of his son Rehoboam, the kingdom was split right down the middle, and there was a northern kingdom with 10 tribes and the southern kingdom, which is what we're talking about that's left today. So God, through his prophet, rehearses some history, but he pictures the north like a bride, sister wife. And this sister, he said, she went off and did her own thing. And so I wrote her a certificate of divorce. I said, you want to be unfaithful to me? We are divorced. This is cut off. I thought that her sister, Judah, would see this and learn a thing or two because of it. But instead of that happening, she went the opposite direction. She decided she's just going to keep doing her own thing, and it just kept getting worse. That's kind of the analogy there, which brings to mind a number of things, right? Because you talk about, if you want to talk about a king with wife problems, probably Solomon would be your guy, right? Had 999, way too many wives. And he probably should have learned a thing or two from his dad on that one. Not that his dad had as many that we know of, but he still had wife problems that led to a lot of issues. Solomon should have been aware of that, but didn't learn a lesson. I kind of think about that. But then God uses this analogy, okay? Well, what does Leviticus 18:18 say?
Do not take your wife's sister as a rival wife and have sexual relations with her while your wife is living.
Yeah. In the law of Moses, what does it say? No sister wives. That is something that's not supposed to happen. Now, when did that happen? Way back in the beginning. Where did the name Israel come from? A guy named Jacob who struggled with God. Well, Jacob really wanted a wife and didn't get the right one because he got too drunk. And he was given the wrong one. And so he got Leah instead of Rachel, the weak-eyed girl, poor thing. And and then he got the pretty one that he wanted. So he ended up with 2 wives, sister wives, right from the get-go. And so it's not wrong necessarily for God to use this kind of analogy, because I think it fits with historically what happened. Jacob did have sister wives. Now, was that a very harmonious wife-to-wife relationship? No. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, God didn't design that relationship to be a man, wife, 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 wife relationship. And there's clearly going to be a lack of harmony when you go that direction. So the New Testament kind of clarifies this and just keeps it going for us, right? But even back then, they knew this was against God. Isn't it kind of funny? I mean, even though we know, yeah, historically it makes sense. Jacob, the one who struggled with God, his name was changed to Israel, and then his sons, the 12 tribes, and it grew from there. Jacob did have sister wives. So the analogy kind of makes sense, but should that analogy be taken very far? You know what I'm saying? Are we to picture God as one who, he is the one that married the 2 sisters historically, and now he's the bride of his church, and we just keep going? I'm saying this, it might be kind of cold to you, so sorry if it is. I want to exercise a word of caution because there's a movement that I've been looking into a little bit because they're very concerning to me. And from what I can tell, this movement is largely a result of churches that, people within churches that were taught really shallow theology or just not good teaching at all, and they were seeking something greater. And this particular movement offered something much deeper than the typical shallow theology that's out there. It's called the Hebrew Roots Movement. That's the name I've heard for it. I'm sure there are others for it. But the Hebrew Roots Movement is not a movement that I fully grasp, but the basic idea that I understand is that we are supposed to observe the Old Testament laws of God, but with grace. In other words, you don't have to obey the law of God to be saved. We just do it because, God, we love you so much, so we're going to obey the Old Testament law to the letter. But obviously, it's Christ's sacrifice that saves us. See how kind of fuzzy that is, kind of shady that is? And one of the particular ministries online that tries to advance this, in their videos, I just was looking into them and thought, all right, what's all this about? One of the ways that they really make a big deal about this is, at least in this particular site, is they use the marriage illustration. They talk about God and the certificate of divorce that he wrote his people. And they go on from there, and forgive me if I don't explain this very well because it's challenging, but they go on from there to say, well, God obviously can't remarry because in the Old Testament law that wasn't permitted, so therefore God had to die. Bring in the cross. God died through the cross. And then he was free up to marry again, the same one that he had divorced because he had died. So who did he remarry again? Well, I guess it's Israel. And I guess we've been grafted into the old Israel, and we can use the old Israel's commands, and we should, but, stir in the grace. And it's confusing, all right? It's confusing, and I think one of the easy points that we can make right off the bat is that they're pushing this marriage analogy a little bit too far. They really are. Because if you want to push that marriage analogy, then I got to ask the question, well, why does God have sister wives when he said you're not allowed to have sister wives? Doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? So whenever you read an analogy in Scripture, you got to be careful. It's very easy to run with it and to come up with some things that will sound, will have an air of intelligence to them. But when you really think it through, you realize this can't be. It doesn't really fit. And I'm just going to warn you, if you look into movements like the Hebrew Roots movement, it's going to sound to a lot of people very well thought out, like they've done their homework. And these people have. A lot of them have done their homework and have spent some time looking into the Bible to defend their views. But I think if you're honestly trying to ask, what does God want us to do? What is he telling his people to do? I think you're going to honestly realize this is not it. Not at all. We don't have a temple today. We can't offer sacrifices. We don't have a Jewish priesthood today either. A lot of people debate whether or not the line of the Jews are still here, as can be traced back to Abraham. I'm of the opinion they aren't. I just don't think so, and I think there's enough evidence to show, after 80, 70, the record's gone, and just the odds of them surviving that long, highly unlikely. But I think it's even more definitive to say that there is no one of the line of Aaron, of the Kohathite clan, that is alive today, pure from that line, who is eligible to be an earthly priest. And for an earthly priest, you need that with an earthly temple to fulfill a huge chunk of the Old Testament law. And you can go through every one of those 613 commands, and you can just start looking them off and say, all right, I got to obey this. I've got a bald spot in my head. What does the law say? Got to go see the priest. Where's the priest? He's not here. The Aaronic priest is not here. Where's the temple? Oh, it's not here. But they'll rebuild it. It's okay. I just got to fly over there. Every time I got another spot in my bald head, I got to fly over there, apparently. Sorry, I'll let you go first.
Okay, well, just it seems like they would have to ignore so much of what we learned in Romans.
Yes.
We have a new priesthood and a new high priest, and if you're going to seriously say that, then you're suddenly you're saying, well, then Jesus isn't our high priest. They can say what they want about grace and his sacrifice, but
Yeah.
there was more there than that. And that's why I suspect a lot of Paul's writings would fly right in the face of what they're saying. Because Paul had a big opinion about
absolutely,
this.
in a very big way. That was why I was so shocked. I thought, man, you've got a lot of scripture to rewrite to make this work.
Yeah.
And they did. They went through the time to figure it all out. I don't think they did it right, but I'm just warning you. There's one right in central Merritt Island. Wonderful, nice group of people. I've gone there a time or two to visit with some of them. So wonderful people. Just a heads up, they're here, and they're big. Do you have a comment?
I was gonna say, I think you said clan, I'm offended.
Oh, okay. Anyway, don't push analogies too far. I think you guys get that. God uses the analogy of the sister wives, but he said in his law that's not something that is supposed to happen. So he's just using that for better our understanding. Continue on here. And the Lord said to me, faithless Israel has proved herself more righteous than treacherous Judah. Go and proclaim these words toward the north. Say, return, faithless Israel, return to the Lord. I will not look upon you in anger, for I am gracious, declares the Lord. I will not be angry forever. Only acknowledge your iniquity, that you have transgressed against the Lord your God and have scattered your favors to the strangers under every green tree, and have not obeyed my voice, declares the Lord. Return, O faithless sons, declares the Lord, for I am a master to you, and I will take you one from a city, two from a family, and I will bring you to Zion. That last verse is very helpful. How can faithless Israel return? Faithless Israel's gone. Faithless Israel technically is the kingdom of the north, and Assyria obliterated them. Well, there are the tiny little remnants, the small amount of people left that didn't get killed or wiped off the map when Assyria invaded. That, I believe, is who God is now referring to. And it makes it more clear. He makes it more clear here. Return to me, and I will take you one from a city, two from a family. In other words, you're scattered everywhere. Some of you may still be there. Most of you are gone. But you individually, come back. Come back to me. And that's another thing that's cool. Like, we've been looking at the nation from a national perspective, and man, it's down the tubes, gone. But individually, it's not that way. It's not hopeless. It's as though God could have written all of them off. But even after writing the whole off, he still says to the individuals, do you want to come back? Do you? Want to come back? Real good lesson on grace, even back in the Old Testament. Really,
I just got to push the point a little bit more. I mean, you already said it, but with verse 1 and verse 8, it's not pushing the analogy too far, because the point he's making is, if somebody divorces and then they remarry, it's an abomination to God to come back. And then in verse 8 he says, I divorced the nation. So for anybody today to say that God's got special plans for the nation, totally goes against this. For individuals, yeah, individual Jews can, but this whole idea that God's going to restore that race just totally contradicts the main point of this whole thing. Sorry.
that non-existent race, in my opinion, just pointing that out. But even if they did exist, yeah,
Yeah.
I totally agree, totally agree. And can you see the insult to this too? Because Jeremiah is talking to Judah, and yet he's saying, Israel, return, come back to me. You know, I'll help you out. And Judah's still here. Like, they've already been punished by God. God already obliterated them, and you're calling out for them to come back, and you're going to do good things for them. But we're right here. You know, I think it's a deliberate slap in their face, even though he turns the attention to them. God's saying, hey, you guys can individually come back. This is where, we'll have to get into more of this next week. Let's close with Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22. If someone could read that, it puts things in perspective. And then we can talk more about this next week, because it really is important. And there was a time where I thought we wouldn't have to discuss all this that much, that the scholars are going to debate it, and then the ones that have these different Israelite beliefs are going to die out, and the church will figure it out. And I think I'm wrong. I think, if anything, the church at large has gone the other direction. And they're coming back to the old covenant and trying to revive it and call it the new covenant. And it's really mistaken. So what does Hebrews 12:22 say to a group of Christians, by the way? Let's put it in context. A group of new covenant Christian people, and it says what? Hebrews chapter 12, verse 22.
But you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. You have come to thousands upon thousands of angels in joyful assembly.
You have come to Mount Zion. You have come to Jerusalem. Have you ever been there? You went to Jerusalem? You went to the mountain of Zion over there? That's a long trip. You went there? You did? I didn't know that. How on earth is he saying you Christians have come to Mount Zion? Mount Zion's a physical location over in the land of Judah, the principal hill in which the temple would sit on. How can he say to all Christians that you've come to Mount Zion? It's a picture.
Of favor.
It's an illustration of the real Mount Zion, God's real kingdom. Who is God's real kingdom? It's his church. That's his kingdom. That's it. So we'll talk more about this next week. Yeah.
I think we want to mention next week is Labor Day.
Thank you. Yeah. It's Labor Day. And so to celebrate Labor Day, we won't do any work. No, I always thought that was kind of funny. But yeah, next Monday and next Tuesday, no classes. Next Monday and next Tuesday. Thank you. I was going to forget that. So, any other questions, comments, thoughts? All right, let's pray. God, thank you for more reminders again, more thoughts that do have to drift into the negative to appreciate the positive. And God, I know as we think about this, it can be disturbing, but at the same time, this is how we know that what we have in your kingdom, the kingdom of your Son, is so wonderful. It's how we understand it so much better. So I want to pray for a renewed appreciation for your church, for what we have here with each other, and a greater love for our brothers and sisters, so that this kingdom can continue to grow here on earth, and we can continue to see your will being done. So I'm asking that you help that to happen, and help our thoughts to be directed your way more in the little things that we're doing in our lives. Even this next week, as we go through a holiday and just the normal day-to-day stuff that comes before and after that too, the normal life stuff. God, help us as we want to give those little things to you, so that you have all of us, and so that we're not just relying on you for the big things to bail us out, but we trust you and we want to serve you. So help us in our attitude with that, and in our ability to encourage each other to live that way. And I'm asking this in your Son's name.
Good work, brother.